Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to wait another minute or so in case additional people will come on the line. Good afternoon. I'm Harriet Hamasi, Dean of the Library at Georgetown University. This afternoon's program is co-sponsored by the library, the Provost Office, and the Georgetown University Press. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation between Deborah Tannen and Maureen Corrigan. They will discuss Professor Tannen's most recent book, Finding My Father. One of New York Times best-selling authors, Deborah Tannen holds the distinguished rank of university professor in the linguistics department at Georgetown. She has written many books and articles about how the language of everyday conversation affects relationships, and it was through decades of conversations with her father and discussing with him his many journal entries that Professor Tannen both researched and then wrote this wonderful book. Joining today's exploration is Maureen Corrigan, author, scholar, and literary critic. Many of you know Maureen through her work as a book critic at NPR's Fresh Air and reviewer of columnists for the Washington Post Book World. Maureen also teaches at Georgetown. She is the Nicky and Jamie Grant Distinguished Professor of Practice in Literary Criticism at Georgetown, and she happens to be on the library's board. So thank you both, Deborah and Maureen, and I now turn it to your very capable hands and minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. This is such a pleasure. Deborah and Deborah, I know you as a distinguished colleague, a world-famous linguist, and also I'm happy to say as a friend. And during this very strange pandemic year, you and I have been emailing every once in a while, and it turns out we have a lot in common. We both have Polish roots. We both had relatives who were involved in the Communist Party. And we also are both in mixed marriages and experienced some family weirdness connected with that. So it's been wonderful for me to get to know you on that level. In this memoir and biography of your father, I've gotten to know you as a daughter, which is a whole other side of you. Your father has to be one of the great chroniclers of Jewish life in the 20th century. He kept letters, he kept diaries, he kept photographs. I mean, it's almost as though he kept his own personal library of his life, which he then shared with you. And what I'd like to start off by asking you is, what was your earliest awareness that you were destined, at least in his mind, to play Boswell to his Dr. Johnson, to be his chronicler?
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you so much for doing this. And I feel the same way. I'm so honored, and it's such a pleasure to have you as a colleague, as a friend, and someone I admire for your own writing. I would have to trace it to the 1980s when my father first, I think it was really his idea that I would do this. I actually, as you said, he saved, sometimes the way I put it, every piece of paper that came into his life. So he kept, I think, every letter he ever received and copies of many of the letters that he wrote. And so I have a letter where he wrote to someone in the 80s. In one case, Deborah is going to write a book about the Jews of Warsaw based on my memories. And I think that's how we both thought of it in the beginning, because he was born in Warsaw in 1908, came to this country in 1920. So the first 12 years of his life, he was in Warsaw in a Hasidic community. And these, when you say Hasidim now, you think of a somewhat marginal sect within a larger community. At that point, Jews were more than half the population of Warsaw, and the majority of them were Hasidim. So his details were extremely, his memories were extremely detailed. And so I thought of it as a document of the life of the Jews of Warsaw, but very gradually, over at least until the mid 90s, it started to become clear to me that his entire life was worth documenting. He lived to be 98, so pretty much his life spans the 20th century. And all the cataclysmic events of that century affected him, affected his life, and his detailed journals that he kept before he married, memories that he began writing after he retired at 70. So 30 years after he first began writing things, that he kept these, as you say, chronicles of his life and of his times. So by the mid 90s, I was pretty clear that it was going to be the span of his life. And I think he also began thinking of it that way. And I even found something where he said, in writing some of his memories, maybe someday someone will write a book on this, as I suggested to Deborah recently. So, and I remember thinking at that point, oh, I thought it was my idea.
Yeah,
I guess it was his.
I jotted down a quote of his from early in your book where he said, this is in 1979? He said, it's a note from him. He says, if you write it, meaning this book, basically, while I'm still alive, you'll have to think of my feelings.
And I think I comment there.
Yeah.
I was still thinking of his feelings when I was writing the book, but thinking what his feelings were.
Yeah.
He
was funny, which is one of the, of course, very attractive qualities that comes through in this book. He's very fast with words. I wonder where you get it from. And
he was quicker.
Yeah, I wonder if you would read some of his, I don't know, some of the trademark quips that you quote in the book.
Yeah, sure. Just to give a sense of who he was, let me show you a quick picture. So that's the cover, and that's him with me when I was a kid. And by the way, that is the only existing photograph of just the two of us. And it wasn't just the two of us, my mother and sister on the side, but for the cover, I just took that. That's what he looks like. And that was about 30 years ago. And then the other, this inset is him as a kid, and that picture comes off his Polish identity card, which he kept, as he kept everything. Just a few lines. He was very funny, very clever. My mother died 2.5 years before my father died, so he lived in an assisted living facility, and I called him every day and visited very often. But often when I called, I would always start by exactly how he taught me to start phone conversations. What am I interrupting? Because he was very self-effacing, never wanted to be intrusive. And very often he would say, oh, nothing, I'm lying in bed. And I would often say, Daddy, you shouldn't lie in bed all day. And he had different ways that he answered at different times. Once it was, oh, I lie in bed because the floor is too hard. Another time, so if I die, I'll be in position. And another time, I'm practicing. I'm going to be lying under the ground for a long time. He was 97 already when he said that. And he would ask sometimes, how old am I? And I would say, 97. And he'd say, that's ridiculous. What's a 97-year-old man doing walking around? I'll read one last one. I arrived for a visit, and I visit every 3 or 4 weeks. And he was delighted, but he was surprised to see me. And I said, but Daddy, I every day when we talk on the phone, I tell you, I'll be there in 6 days. I'll be there in 5 days. I'll be there in 4 days, right up to yesterday. And he said, no wonder I forgot. You keep changing it.
Yeah, I identify with that kind of humor as being New York humor, which is of course also Jewish humor. And
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
I'd like to tell one more just small anecdote about him again to sort of capture who he was, never wanting to be intrusive or bother anybody. One of the times talking to him on the phone, and he thought of he's lying down, and he thought of something he wanted to tell me, and he said, it's on his desk, I'll get it. Now, I knew he wouldn't want to keep me waiting, and he would rush. And I also knew that he was never very careful. He had a walker, but he wouldn't make sure it was locked. He would plop down without making sure the chair was secure. And so I tried to talk him out of it. No, don't, I don't need it. No, it's fine. I'll go to the phone and I'll call you. And of course, it was a very long time. He didn't call me. And finally, I called him and the phone rang and rang and finally he picked it up. Daddy, where are you? Oh, I'm lying on the floor under my desk. What happened? Well, I slipped off the chair when I sat down. I could have predicted it. I'm thinking, you shouldn't have a chair on wheels. Yeah. And he said, but I'm fine. And I said, I'll call the front desk and have somebody help you. No, don't bother them. I'm fine. But you have to get up. I'll call them. Don't bother them. And we must have gone back 4 or 5 times. I'm calling, don't call, I'm calling. Don't. Finally, he said, okay, you can call them, but make sure you tell them not to rush. They can just come whenever they have time. I'm fine.
Oh my God.
That kind of self-effacing.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, it's great. It was very early when you kind of got anointed as his chronicler. And I guess I'm sort of curious about what your sisters felt about that, because that was a special mark of distinction for you, even before you became the Deborah Tannen who we all know and admire.
Well, thank you. My sisters I have 2 sisters. One is 8 years older, one is 2 years older. The sister who was 8 years older had a very special relationship with my father. She had him to herself for 6 years. And I actually wrote a play about my father going back to Poland with him. And I have a lot of examples in there of how when I tried to talk to him about my childhood, all he could really remember was Naomi's childhood, because he was around when she was a kid and she was the first and I'm the third. So anyone listening who's the third, fourth, fifth, or sixth, you don't, it's not the same as being the first. And so I think she knew that she had a very special relationship with him. Sometimes she was a little bit, I would say, annoyed if I was spending all that much time with him. My middle sister, and I'm really grateful to her for this, she was more inclined to see my mother's perspective on things. And I don't think she really envied all the time I was spending with my father. I don't think she would have really wanted to do that. And by the way, I don't think my sister Naomi either would have enjoyed just sitting for hours talking to him. I don't think either of them really envied me that. So yeah, and I'm grateful to Mimi, because often I might tend to be critical of my mother and idealize my father, and she would set me straight when I was letting him off the hook and being unfair to my mother.
Well, as you pointed out elsewhere, I think that's a particular, I don't know.
It's common.
It's common. I certainly.
It's common for daughters. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But my sister,
you mentioned your mother. I want to talk about her a little bit. And I know I've mentioned this book to you before, but I like to plug it because it's such a wonderful book. It's a book by Paul Cowan, who was a Village Voice writer who died young. And the book's called An Orphan in History. And it came out in the 80s. It was one of the first books that I'm aware of where you have this first person narrative of someone searching for their Jewish roots back in the old country. And Cowan covered the Lower East Side back when it was still like the Lower East Side. So that's how he got into this, thinking about his own Jewish roots. So in the 1980s, when he's trying to do this, so much is not available to him in terms of, obviously computers and genealogical sites that we now have at our disposal in a fingertip. You had your father's treasure trove of documents, photographs, etc. And you and your father, as you say, would sit and talk for hours. Your mother could care less, even about her own history. I mean, I scribbled down one of her quotes about your father's absorption in his family past. Oh, he's talking about his grandfather again, just like, oh, stop already. She reminds me of what Cowan says about immigrants from Central Europe, from Russia, who came over in that great wave that your father was part of, 1880 to 1920. He says that millions of immigrant families left their economically and culturally confining old world towns where they were raised and paid for the freedom and prosperity this country offered with their pasts. And it seems like your mother was happy to make that bargain and your father wasn't. So let's talk about mom for a while, because mothers do get ignored.
The contrast is quite fascinating. My mother also was born in Europe. She was born in Russia, Belarus, Minsk. She also came when she was 11, nearly 12. But she was not interested in talking about it. And I actually have a brief evidence of that. I was in the house talking to my father, recording, so the tape recorder was going. And she came in and was kind of a little bit annoyed. We're still at it. How long are you going to be doing this? By the way, I have 200 cassette tapes of conversations and interviews with my father. So I'm a bit of a hoarder myself. And she kind of said, well, why not? I have to think about my life. Why don't you write a book about me? And I said, oh, I would love to, Mom. And I started asking her questions. This is a transcript of how it went. Started asking her about her past. Do you remember meal times in Russia? Because my father he would describe the meal from beginning to end, how they cooked it, who sat where. And she said, meal times? Yeah, no. Do you remember any friends that you played with in Russia? Yeah, I remember playing in the backyard, with kids. Do you remember any specific friend that you had? Thinking of what I know about my father's friends. No, I don't. Do you remember the house, the layout, who slept where? Vaguely. I remember a dining room, a table and chairs. And then finally she gets annoyed. That's it. We grew up, we came to this country, we went to school. We got married, we had children and grandchildren. There was nothing really too much. Yeah. So I never wrote my mother's stories because she didn't give me any. And I was just talking to my sisters about this. It may be that her past was more traumatic.
Yeah.
My father came from Warsaw, which was pretty advanced city. And they were able to just travel, make a trip across Europe, get on a boat and come. And they did not come steerage. They came second class, didn't even go to Ellis Island. My mother's, she had traumatic memories of what may have been a war or a pogrom in Warsaw, and they had to escape. They were, it's kind of like immigrants today. They were led through the forest by a Polish farmer, and it was cold, and her mother was walking, lost her shoe, they couldn't stop to find it. So that was much more traumatic. And a key time in immigration history, again, is so much of my parents' lives are revealing of history. Yeah, they came at the tail end of that massive migration of Eastern Europeans, Jews, Greeks, Italians, to the United States. So my father came in 1920. That was the last year there were no limits on immigration. Get your head around that.
Yeah.
You just got on, and if you passed inspection in Ellis Island, you were here. 1921, they instituted quotas. 1924, the quotas pretty much shut the doors. Mm-hmm. So my mother tried to come in 21. And the reason she tried to come in 21 is that when her father who came first sent them money and they gave it to someone to lead them out, it was stolen. The guy took the money and disappeared. So they had to do it all again. It was 1921. They had to wait 2 years in Poland until they could come.
Yeah.
So it was so it could be that, but I think it may have just been temperament.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and of course, these stories, once you start talking about them in depth, you just hear the resonances now too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's
And I don't think I understood to what extent my father's being an immigrant shaped his view of himself and his life. He did not have an accent because he came at 12.
Yeah.
And he, as far as, I knew he had been born in Europe. I thought it was exotic. I got a kick out of it, but I didn't really think of him as an immigrant.
Yeah.
Again, letters. I found a letter that he wrote to an aunt still in Poland when he was 25, married, had passed the bar. He was a lawyer, though not working as a lawyer.
Yeah.
Because it was the Depression. And he says in the letter to this aunt, I've always felt myself part of that life and not of the life that I'm living here. And I think he always felt that way.
Yeah. Yeah. That foot in both worlds, or maybe more so in that old world. You become like a private investigator in part when you start this journey of digging into your father's past. And it seems like he gives you carte blanche to read the letters, look at the photographs. One of the things that I thought was so interesting is that you find out about some of your female forebears in Poland. And I'm thinking about Dora and Magda, and their stories are not what I would expect for women in the old country at that time. Would you tell everybody a little bit of their background?
Yes, I will. And again, I think it's revealing about what you think of when you think of a Hasidic community. So my father lived in a household with his mother's parents because his father had died when he was very young of tuberculosis. So they lived in his mother's house, and 9 of her siblings. There were 13 whose life stories I can tell you, but the brothers only studied Talmud. They did not have secular education. The women, except for the oldest one, did all get secular education. So my grandmother was the founder and principal of the school for girls, first school for Hasidic girls in Poland. There was a dentist, periodontist, who retrained in this country and was a periodontist in New York. And Dora, who studied in Zurich, mathematics and physics. She studied physics with Einstein. And the family story was that they had an affair. It didn't work out. And I have asked several Einstein biographers about this, and apparently that was not that unusual. Yeah. But then when he came to this country and moved to Princeton, she was already in this country. She went to Princeton to be with him, and their affair rekindled. And I do have various types of evidence that was true. My father told me that his aunt, the dentist, who was close with Dora because they were very close in age, told him that she had a letter from Dora saying that she was pregnant with Einstein's child and was seeking an abortion, which apparently she was able to get. Apparently she was this was after his wife had died. So she believed that he was going to marry her, and he didn't. And apparently she was disappointed and went as far away as she could to California. Yeah. I have and by the way, the Einstein archive includes a handwritten letter of recommendation by Einstein about her, saying, we have known each other. I've known her very well for many years. She's an extremely talented physicist, mathematician, great educator. Obviously, it's a recommendation for a teaching job, which she never got in this country. And the last one of the many letters in my father's, in the piles of letters he left me, is a letter from Dora to her sister Eva. How he got it, I don't know. And she says in it that she has found a way to support herself. She is crocheting baby jackets. And if she can break into the Hollywood crowd and sell them there, she's sure that she will make a better living than she could ever do teaching. And I think that by teaching, she meant giving private lessons of some sort. And so it's quite tragic about the fate of many immigrants who come to this country with tremendous qualifications that they really can't,
Yes.
especially women, especially women.
Yeah.
So quickly, Magda. Magda was the youngest of all these brothers and sisters, only 6 years older than my father. So she was more like an older sister than like an aunt, and he adored her. She was very kind to him. There was only one other person who really was, and that was his grandmother. His mother was not. She was tough. And so Magda often protected him from his mother. He said she saved him many beatings. And so he adored her. Magda, when my father told me his own words, when he came to this country at 12, he already identified as an atheist, a communist, and a Zionist. The communism and atheism came from Magda. It was the Bolshevik Revolution. She was a teenager. As young people in so many eras, including our own, look around and my own past, so many of us look around, you see injustice, you see inequality, you see so much unfairness, and you believe there's a better way. And at that time, communism was brand new. And there was tremendous belief that the Bolshevik Revolution was going to bring equality. There would be no more hatred among groups. There would be no more mistreatment of workers. And so he was swept up in that. And apparently Magda gathered her communist colleagues in their house, because it was they had so many brothers and sisters. It was a big kitchen. They would gather there on Friday night after the parents went to bed. Magda survived. She never came to this country. I actually have, again, among my father's papers, I don't know how he got them, papers from the uncle who brought all the oldest brother who brought all of them to this country. He had apparently filed papers trying to bring Magda and one other remaining sister, but it was 1923 and it was too late. Couldn't do it. So she was in jail as a communist when the Germans came in. She spent 8 years of her life in prison as a communist. Fortunately for her, the prison was very close to the Russian border. And when the Germans took over the townspeople let the prisoners out. The guards apparently ran away. And so she made it over the border to Russia. For those interested in politics, apparently most of the Polish communists who made it to Russia were immediately sent to Siberia. But she apparently had an affidavit from the Ukrainian communists who had been in prison with her that she was loyal to the Soviet Union. And so they let her stay, and she had tremendous hardships there. She married, her husband was killed in an accident. Her baby died of starvation.
Oh my God.
She had left another child back in Poland, who also from a previous marriage that did survive. But she survived. She came back to Poland and became a high-ranking official in the Polish government. So when I spent a month in Poland after graduating from college, I was driven around by a chauffeur. She and her husband were both very high up there in the government, and she had a servant in the house helping her cook and clean. Now she did comment to my father, this is not what we fought for.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Both of their stories, it just really dramatized the vagaries of fate. If you're in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, and your whole life changes. And I want to make sure that we have time to talk about another woman who plays a big role in your father's story, and also your discovery of her letters with your father is one of the dramatic high points, I think, of this memoir. You call her Helen to protect her privacy. But please talk about the letters that you discover, her role in your father's life. And if you would, read a snippet from one of her letters, because her voice I wish I could have met Helen. She really lives on the page.
And thank you. I wish I had met her. Yeah, I guess we all have alternative lives that we might have lived if we had made different decisions. And often it's marriage, had we married somebody else. And many people have people they might have married, but for whatever reason didn't. Both my parents talked about Helen as someone my father might have married rather than my mother. My mother referred to her as her rival. My father made comments about her that made me, and this was when they were old. They didn't talk about this when I was growing up. I'm talking about when they're old, and they both lived to be quite old. I was once in one of these many conversations with my father. I referred to Helen as his other girlfriend, referred to my mother as his other girlfriend. And he said, "Your mother wasn't my girlfriend. Helen was my girlfriend." No, why did he marry my mother? And one time I said something about, were you dating Helen at the same time as, I never really dated your mother. Well, we were together a lot. I guess I was sort of like a boyfriend, especially the last year. I also felt that in many ways my parents were not so well matched. And so I developed a kind of a fantasy that maybe Helen would have been better suited to my father. This is all terribly Freudian.
And he kept all of her letters.
And he told me that he had kept her letters and would give them to me if he could find them, but he no longer knew where they were. So one time I'm in the house, he says he's going down to the storage area. They lived in a condominium. Fine, he said, I go down with him, he gets what he's looking for. And I say, why don't we look for those letters? And he said, fine. My father was very organized, so it was not as hard. If it were me, it would take a year to go through everything. He had everything labeled. So it didn't take that long, but we went through all the boxes, all the bags, and we didn't find them. There was one box remaining. It was on the highest shelf off to the side. I reached for the box and pulled it away from the wall, and I heard a plop. So I reached behind the box and sure enough, pulled it out. It was wedged between the box and the back wall in the fire shelf. And he must have carried these from home to home and kept them hidden. And I don't think he was hiding the fact of Helen, but maybe the fact that he was saving the letters. Probably 15 moves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you read a little from one?
Yeah. And I should say too that I also found in that envelope the copies of many of my father's letters to her. Yeah, I'm going to read snippets from just a couple of just letters. She, like my father, was very attuned to language. So she addresses him in one of the letters as "you old mothball." And then she says, "Very dangerous weather for a mothball to be out in." And then she says, "Isn't that a funny idiom?" Which is really the kind of comment that my father would make. Another time she describes being in a out in the country, and she describes how she's lying, looking at nature and trying to find that specific one. Let me just read this one then. It's this is toward the end, and it's I followed their entire relationship through the letters, and I'm able to solve some of the mysteries that I had myself about what happened when. But this is now things are getting. She's realizing that things are not going to work out for them, and she describes the house. The house is so still and brooding. The furniture stands upright, as though waiting for everyone to go to bed before it begins a midnight dance. Awfully weird thought to have when you're all alone in a sleeping house. And one last tiny bit. So my father made the decision to get married really on impulse. He felt he could not get married because he was the sole support of his mother and sister. And it's the Depression. He's barely able to support them. There's no way he can support a family. So that's the reason he felt he couldn't get married. And she says, your letters, now here, I think he's seeing that he's going to make the decision to marry my mother. Your letter sounded so desperate, so hopeless. And because of some odd notion of mine, I always felt, even if I never removed any trouble you may have had, I helped to alleviate it. I tried to change your uncompromising view of it. And so what she's actually saying is that she wants to make him feel less desperate about the decision to reject her. She sounds like a lovely person.
Yeah, she does sound lovely. So the question that goes along with that is, I don't know, did anything that you read in the back and forth of their relationship make you draw back from your father a little bit? Yeah.
Oh, that takes a lot.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
No, yes and no. Well, she writes so beautifully, and he writes in this rather stilted way. He also talked like a book. He really learned English from reading.
Yeah.
So that made me kind of side with her over him. But what I really saw was just the lack of opportunity that people at that time had,
Yes.
and the pressure that women were under to marry.
Yes.
If they didn't marry, their lives were ruined.
Yes.
And by the way, my parents felt that way about me too. So that they brought those old world values.
Yes. Right, of course. Yeah.
As well.
Would you show your parents' wedding picture? This book is just dotted with so many wonderful photographs, and that's one that really deserves to be seen.
Okay.
I
That's
love
no
that.
photo. Now, my
children-
father was tall, my mother was short, but here he's sitting on the arm of a chair and she's standing. But and maybe this is kind of in the spirit of the entire book, and maybe in the spirit of anyone trying to understand your parents. I knew that wedding photo my entire life. It was always there in the house. During one of these many interviews and conversations I had with my father, he mentioned that picture wasn't taken at the wedding. It wasn't? No. And if I'd thought about it, I would have realized it didn't make sense. They eloped. They decided on the spur of the moment to marry. They went to City Hall. They didn't tell anybody. There was no wedding at the moment they married. They eventually had a wedding in her parents' backyard, but this picture wasn't taken there either. It turns out he had a friend who was a photographer, and when that friend heard that they had no wedding photo, he offered to take one. And they were too poor to pay for one, so he offered to do it as a favor.
Yeah.
So she bought the dress and those beautiful gloves going up past her elbow for the picture, not the wedding.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's such a wonderful backstory to that compelling photograph, because it underscores what we all know, but we forget that the evidence before your eyes isn't quite always what you think it is, and even you with this treasure trove of letters and documents, some of them aren't quite reliable. Your dad isn't quite reliable sometimes as the narrator of his own story, so it just keeps ballooning out that way.
Yeah, it's so funny too that things that don't make sense, you don't really think about it. You've told those stories your whole life,
Right.
and you don't really question them. There's another quote that I like a lot. This was a story by Ethan Kanan, and in the story, it's about coming into a television show that's in process. And he says, I came in too late to understand. But I think that's true about trying to understand our parents. We really come in too late to understand them,
Yes.
but we keep trying.
Yes. Deborah, we've just scratched the surface, and I feel like I want to leave enough time for the audience to ask their questions. And I also want to acknowledge there's so much about your father's public life that we haven't covered, because when he arrives in this country, he has to leave school at 14. He works in the garment industry, gets involved in politics there, as you say, goes to law school. But, I'm always struck in the book by you mentioning an interviewer who says to you, what do you mean you grew up working class? Your father has a law degree, just also the shifts in class identity.
Yes, yes, yes. Someone said to me, this was a journalist who had interviewed me for an article, and he said, something in my notes doesn't make sense. You said you were raised working class, and you said your father's a lawyer. They can't both be true. And they are both true.
Yeah.
He went to law school at night. He never graduated from high school. He got his high school equivalency at night, graduated from law school, got a master's in law, passed the bar, doing all that at night, and it was the Depression.
Yeah.
And so I asked him, when he sat down to write his life, he started by making a list of all the jobs he had held and the work he had done, and it came to 68.
Yeah.
And then he began describing each one in great detail. And that was his view of his life. It was the work that he did. And he regarded that list with a combination of pride that he did whatever he had to do to support his family, and regret that he sacrificed so much to get that law degree, really thinking he would practice law as soon as he got the degree. But it was not until he was 50 and I was in junior high that he was able to escape the factory and make a living as a lawyer.
Well, I think, and this pandemic has made us much more aware of how history intervenes in the plans that you have for your life, and certainly our students have had a taste of that, and maybe we can feel more compassion for those earlier generations who had their lives derailed.
I think that's so true. Yes.
Yeah. I want to ask you in closing, because your father is also he is the presence in this memoir, in this book, and he himself, as we know, has such a wonderful voice. Maybe if you would end our conversation by reading from one of his letters or from one of your conversations in which his voice really comes through, and then we'll turn things over to our audience.
Yes, it's very short, just less than a paragraph. What I'm going to read, so as I said, he didn't really know his own father. He had 4 memories of having seen his father when he was very young. He was 6 when his father died, but he had left the house when my father was 2. But there's one memory where his father speaks to him, and this is a description of that. So he must have been, probably 5 at the time. I was walking with him in the country, and we came to a brook. He wanted me to cross it with him, but I was afraid. I was convinced the bottom was quicksand and would suck me in. He picked up a large green pine cone and threw it into the water to show me that it didn't sink. For some reason, that reassured me, and I crossed the brook with him. Later, we came to a field of wheat. I still recall it as one of the most beautiful sights I've ever seen. The yellow wheat curved in the breeze as far as I could see. I asked my father if the wheat field went to the end of the world. And it's in the epilogue to the book, because I like to think that the reason he asked whether the wheat field goes to the end of the earth was his way on some level of saying maybe he could keep his father with him, although he never did spend time with his father, but maybe the beauty of the wheat field had something to do with the sense of comfort being with his father. And then I make the leap that with all the stuff he left me, and having read this book, having written the book and having the book, I get to keep my father with me till the end of the earth.
Yeah, I think that's true. And honestly, I'm grateful to you for sharing him with us. It's a wonderful memoir. And now let's turn things over to the audience who's been so patient.
But first, I have to thank you, Maureen, so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Well, both of you did a fabulous job in helping us understand so much about your father. Deborah, you've enticed us to read the book if we've not done so already. We have some really wonderful questions from the audience, and I'll just read out a few of them. Let me begin with the first question that was received. How did your father conceptualize or react to the way Poland had changed from his youth and his memories to what it was like during your visit after college?
Yes, and I went back to Poland twice with my father. I think all all European Jews feel you can't think of Poland without thinking of the Holocaust. And all the relatives, other than Magda, who had stayed in Poland, of course, were killed in World War II. Had he stayed, he would have been killed, and he knew that. And his memories of Poland, when he was a kid, of course, include many of anti-Semitism. At the same time, his memories of his childhood in Warsaw, his memories of that large family, were nostalgic. And I think that's so true for so many immigrants. He was part of a community. He described it when he talked about the family. He said, that's what I love most, the liveliness, the warmth of so many aunts and uncles. So I think it was that mixed feeling. And plus he adored his Aunt Magda, and she was there. So when we visited Poland, it was to visit this aunt that he loved. She also lived to be 92. So I think it was with that ambivalence.
Thank you, Deborah. Another question. Actually, there are a couple of questions that talk about the really enormous amount of material that was available to you. And one specific question is, how did you work it all in, and were there things that you didn't fit into the book that you wish you could have?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that question. And it breaks my heart. Some people who know me know how long it took me to write this book. I usually figure, I have a book every 3 years, maybe 4 if it's a lot. And this was something like 7 for this one. It was very hard. And my first draft was over 400 pages. My last final draft was less than 250. So that's a lot of stuff that got left out. And it broke my heart to have to leave all that stuff out. But I did have to realize that not everybody wanted to read every little detail about my father's life as I did. And maybe some of it would be of interest to some people. For example, his detailed memories of description of life in Warsaw, but I could only give snippets to give a sense. But I've got it all, much of it in piles around me right now. You can't see it because you only see the bookcase. And I'm going to be leaving all these papers in the Georgetown Library. So, Harriet, you can read as much as you want.
Terrific, wonderful. So another question sort of along the same lines is, how do you think your writing would have been impacted if you only had the oral memories of your father, not the written ones? And do you think that, for example, today, genealogy services and document databases could be helpful to a person who wants to write?
Yes, I think there's a lot more available online. To give it, just an example, my father was very eager to find out what happened to Helen. He said many times if he had known, if he felt terribly guilty that he could only marry one of these 2 women and it wasn't her. I imagine if he'd married her, he would have felt guilty toward my mother. He felt he said if had he known that she married, he could lie more comfortably in his grave. So I tried to find out. I actually hired a private investigator. And I was not able to find out. After my father was gone, with all the stuff available online, I was able to find out that she married. So I've told him wherever he is, he can rest more. Although, as a friend pointed out to me, that doesn't necessarily mean she was so happy. I mean, maybe she was happier unmarried than my mother was married. But but I think it's very sad to me to realize I wouldn't have all those letters if he had been writing emails instead. Now, he did learn to use email when he was 90, and he printed out copies for me, as well as, and I printed out many of the ones he sent me, so I do have those too. But all the information that I got from letters that he wrote to people and that he saved, that wouldn't be there anymore, and that's a loss.
So another question about a person wanting to write a memoir of their father's without such meticulous notes. What would you say to that person? How should they go about it?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is don't try to decide in advance what's going to be interesting and important. Just get as much information as you can. Conversations, ask questions, depending on who, if the person is still alive, they may or may not be eager to have talk to you at great length. So if they are, then you've got an easier time of it, but otherwise it may just be take bits as you get them. Talk to everybody else who may have known them, who may have known the world that they moved in, who may have known something about the world that they were part of. So and I would say just follow every lead and just collect all the information and decide later what you can do with it.
Great. So Deborah, one last question, unless something else comes on screen, is you've written so many books. This must have been a very different kind of writing and a different kind of experience of composing. Would you talk about that?
Yes, and thank you for asking. It's my 13th book. I kind of wish it was 12. I don't like the number 13, not that I'm superstitious. And it was completely different. It was harder to write because I didn't really know how to write it. There was so much different material. There were my memories of my father as a kid. There were everything he wrote about his many jobs, his political life. I got the FBI has a file on him because of his communist activity. I got his copy of his FBI file. Maybe just for the fun of it, I'll show you what some of those pages looked like.
Oh.
Everything blacked out, but I did learn some from it. And then this mystery of Helen and why he married my mother and not Helen, and everything I found from the letters. I mean, at one point I thought, well, maybe that's a whole separate book. So there were so many different parts to it that it was very, very challenging. And I think that's one of the reasons. I think that is the reason it took me so long to write. A lot of people, friends of mine, seeing how I was struggling and knowing that normally I just sit down and write books and, the process is not an issue, said it must be because the material is so emotional and difficult. And I kept saying, I don't think that's it. I think it's that I don't know how to write a book like this. I know how to write. And I'll tell you one last thing. I actually first proposed writing a book about my father, wrote a proposal to my publisher in the 90s. And they didn't want it. I proposed a book called The Argument Culture, which is about public discourse, and the book about my father. And they said, if you want to write that book about public discourse, you have to write another book about relationships. I was young, relatively, and I thought, I have all the time in the world. So I said, fine, I put the book about my father aside. I would have written it while he was alive if they had accepted. I do think it's better to have written it after he was gone. As he said, I couldn't be quite as honest if he was alive. But that was, way, way back then. So what was it? How did I start this? I know I'm freezing.
And how this was a very different kind of book to write.
Oh, yeah. So this is just the last thing about the writing process. When I proposed the book to my publisher this time, and I had a draft, but still I felt that I had said I want to write it first and I don't want a contract. Then I decided I need a contract. The publisher said, again, if you want us to publish this book about your father, you need to write a book about relationships first. And my first reaction was, you can't make me. This is the book I want to write. And then I realized that would be a pleasure to write the kind of book I know how to write. And so I put it aside. I wrote the book called You're the Only One I Can Tell, which is about women's friendships. And I really got my confidence back. I knew just how to do it. I did the interviews. I took notes. I blocked out the chapters. I wrote the book. And I kind of reminded myself that I really do know how to write books. And then I wrote this one. And so.
So the really interesting thing, Deborah, is that you, in writing this book about your father, you did write about relationships, right?
Yes. Yes, and more backstory. I don't know how interesting you all find this. Up until the time the catalog went to press, I was resisting calling it a memoir. I said, it's not a memoir, it's a biography of my father. But in the meantime, each time I revised it more and more was about me. And I realized I couldn't really write about my father without writing about our relationship. And it's about his relationship with all the people in his life, but also my relationship with him. So yes, it's all about relationships.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you, Maureen, for excellent questions and guiding the conversation this evening. I want to make sure that all of our viewers are aware that copies of Finding My Father are available at a discount, a 10% discount at Politics and Prose bookstore here in DC. And if you did not notice the code that was sent to you at the time that you registered, we will be sending a follow-up email to share that information with you as a reminder of where you can purchase the book and the discount that's available to you. This was really a wonderful program, conversation between two good friends, between two writers and people who are so familiar with words and talking not just to each other, but to all of us who are listening. So thank you again. Thanks for all the folks who came to hear, a really great crowd tonight, and wish you well. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.